The question of what kind of solution is the more plausible or the less implausible
Yeah.
of the two main options being one state and two state. You recently weighed in pro two state on Twitter, I mean, but you've just now outlined one of the reasons two state is so unlikely. The growth of settlements has continued relentlessly. You know, in the standard two state plan, Israel keeps the big settlements closest to the borders, does land swaps with the Palestinians to compensate for that.
Right, you can't do that now.
But, well, right, because there's so many settlements further away that
you would to do a two-state solution now. I mean, you could still do some annexations and land swaps, but at this point, to have a viable two-state solution, you would need to do a meaningful amount of forced displacement of Israeli citizens,
right? Of evacuation
from the West Bank.
And there's now like over 200,000 of those.
Yeah, I mean it's hundreds of thousands of people, which is like, again, you can check the tape on this, but like I spent a lot of time saying that they should not do this because they
not expand not build more settlements. Yeah.
I still think that it is more plausible that you get the Israeli government to do large-scale settlement evacuations than that you get the Israeli government to disband the Jewish state as such. That being said, I'm also not that invested in like me saying which would be preferable. The main thing I would say about this is that I could tell you, and anybody could tell you, like what it would take to have a two-state solution, you know, which is to say something like the old maps from Annapolis or Camp David, which at this point in time would entail large-scale settlement evacuations, but it's logistically tractable. Versus one-state solution, I just don't think that the people who are excitedly for that have done much of the spade work, you know, like where I read the PDF that like explains how that works. I think it's telling, you know, the Arab League and the OIC, you know, just put out their Organization of the Islamic Conference, their like resolutions on the war. And, you know, they're calling for arms embargo on Israel and all various things. What they advocate for in that memorandum is a two-state solution, which again, it's not to say like we need to do what the Arab League and the Organization of the Islamic Conference has to say. But if you want to reboot this issue around the idea of binationalism, which a lot of people seem to want to do, I think there's a lot of political groundwork that they have not laid. I think that this like carping about the slogans is to some extent like a distraction from
it's not
the actual question.
It's not unrelated. I mean, I think there's two reasons Israelis and some American Jews don't like the slogan "From the River to the Sea." There are the people who really think that everyone's using it wants genocide or wants to drive the Jews out of Israel or something, or even to, you know, eliminate the Jewish state per se. Whereas there are the people who understand that a lot of people chanting it at these demonstrations are just saying, give Palestinians full rights, let them vote and so on. But if you play that out, it leads to the end of Zionism. If Zionism is seen, it probably does. If Zionism is seen as you know, formal preferences for Jews as they now enjoy in immigration and some property rights.
No, but I don't think that's the issue though, right? Like I think there you're eliding an important question, right? Which is, so you can imagine, or we can postulate a world in which, you know, the Jewish state as such is dismantled, that there's equal rights for everybody, there's no special law of return, and there's a secular binational democracy that happens to be approximately 50% Jewish in its inhabitants.
Right.
And everybody gets along well. And there's like Hebrew Arabic diglossia, or there's parallel school systems or whatever it is, but everyone's just chugging along. And so in some sense, right, like in the formal terms, like Zionism would be dead. under those postulates. But the people who we now know of as the Israeli people are like, they're doing fine. Right. There's been a loss of the theoretical right of diaspora Jews with no family ties to Israel to just like apparate in the Tel Aviv. But everybody's doing well. I think the concern that most people have, regardless of what the subjective meaning in the heads of the people saying free Palestine from the river to the sea, right, is that the reality of what would occur. Right. If tomorrow Netanyahu was like, oh, shit, I've been reading some good Instagram memes and I realized that settler colonialism is wrong. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop the bombing and we are going to hold an election in which everyone currently resident within the boundaries of former Mandate Palestine can vote on equal terms for the Knesset. And like what would actually occur if he said that would be civil war and state collapse.
You think that's the fear, that it would immediately happen? I mean, I certainly agree.
That there is no proposal on the table for like a structure. Like, so for example, Hamas is a heavily armed Islamist militia that like is not committed to a secular democracy in which everybody lives in peace. Now, it's fine for a secular binational state to contain an Islamist political party, just as it would contain, like, these various
Zionist
Jewish,
just
these various Jewish religious parties that are part of the Israeli landscape. But you couldn't have like an armed militia as like a state within a state. You would need some process to disarm them. You would need some process for reorganizing the IDF. You would need to do something about extremist settler groups, right? Like it would be a very, very, very challenging problem. I think quite a bit more challenging than forcibly evacuating far-flung settlements, which itself is a hard problem, right? But we don't have, if everybody was looking at the history of Lebanon, right? And the story of Lebanon was, this has just like gone amazing. Right? We've got Muslims, we've got Christians, we've got Jews, not Jews, Druze, I want to say it correctly. No majority. Everyone's just like living their best lives in peace and security, democracy, freedom. You'd be saying like, why can't we do that in Israel? Right? But that's not the history of Lebanon. It's not the history of Syria. It's not even really the history of Egypt, whose Christian population.
All these countries have their own stories, and you can point to Lebanon got invaded by Israel. Syria was subject to a proxy regime change operation by the U.S. and allies, and so on. I mean, if you're talking about fairly recent history, but let me be clear. There are two questions. What do you think Israelis fear about a one-state solution, even if they understand that it begins by people just saying one person, one vote, including Palestinians? What is it they fear happening? There's that question. Then there's the question is, what do you think would happen? I think you just said you think there's a good chance. I'm
just talking about what I think.
Right.
Because there's two different groups of people. Well, there's many groups of people. But like one question is like, what's in the heads of Americans who go march on the National Mall? Another question is like, what's in the heads of people who live in Palestine? Right? Like these are sort of different things. Just as I think that if American Jews ran the Israeli government, we would have had a settlement freeze and a two-state solution long ago. I think that if like all of Palestinian politics was organized by Western leftists, they would have a really compelling campaign for secular binational democracy, right? But like, it's not, like I've talked to Palestinian activists in the West Bank, like,
what do they say? We'd start a civil war if they gave us the vote?
No, but they say, we're going to get our land and our homes back.
Well, right. Now, that's a slightly separate issue. But I mean, that's certainly one of the fears, is that in terms of what Israelis fear,
right.
I think the fears, what they fear about, even if they understand what is meant by from the river to the sea by kind of leftists in America. So what is the fear about that if it really just means one person would vote? I think there are some pretty vague fears that amount to, well, they will run us out of the land one way or the other. In other words, less specific than the fear you just outlined. But I do think One specific fear is right of return, untrammeled right of return. They'll show up with the keys to the houses that their parents inhabited and say, well, it looks like a new home, but we still get this land, even if the key doesn't work anymore. And I think that's a specific fear, and it's hooked up to a vaguer fear of getting run off the land. Now, I mean, I'd say a couple of things in reply. I mean, there's a lot to say. One, it doesn't so much speak to the Civil War fear, which I guess resides largely in fear of like what Hamas would do in a way. We could address that. I do think that if you had a democracy with about 50% of the vote Palestinian, about 50% Israeli Jews, you would start off with the Israeli Jews having way more wealth and entrenched power. And you know how democracy works. It wouldn't be like they lost control of the situation overnight, assuming things continue to work through legal, formal channels, right, through the channels of governance. Now, I know you have a separate fear, but that's one thing I would say about the fear that, oh, the Palestinians immediately control the government and push us out. I mean, democracy is more complicated than that, right?
Absolutely. But so here's what I have to say about that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like, I could, just like somebody can say to me, Matt, two-state solution, what are you talking about? These settlements are everywhere. And then I could be like, yeah, but like, you could just make people leave. Like, this is doable. The flip side, one state, Bob, like, what are you talking about? This is going to be chaos. It's going to be disaster, civil war. And you're like, no, like, we can work it out. Like, we can, right? Like, there are constitutional structures and there are confidence building measures and there are disarmament. Like, there's ways to do things. What I think, as someone who is trying to be like more agnostic about these things, is that I can find fairly detailed two-state solution documentation, if you know what I mean. Like people who have done the legwork, people who have advocated for it, like major international players who are committed to it, concepts, things like that. I don't see, and I may just have missed it, but I really have been looking for like, where is the political work on the Palestinian side?
You mean the planning or you mean a picture of what it would be like or a transitional plan?
A little of both. Like what are we doing here, right? So, I mean, one, people raise the South Africa analogy all the time. And, as with all analogies, it's imperfect, but I think it's a reasonable-ish one to raise. If you look at ANC political documents going back to the 50s, they are talking like very clearly about equal voting rights and equal citizenship rights for everyone. Now people would say, right, like some defenders of the apartheid regime would say all the time, like Mandela is just lying. Like this is a plot for a communist takeover.
Right.
But it wasn't just that like some third parties on a podcast would be like, no, I think you're wrong about that. Like they had an official political program.
Yeah.
There isn't, as far as I know, like an organized Palestinian political movement with a recognized leader and spokesperson that has a like authoritative, here is our one state campaign document that says what it is we are asking for. There is the desiccated and discredited PLO with the two-state solution. And there's Hamas and Islamic Jihad, with whatever it is they're on about. And then there are campus organizers in the United States who are like saying this, that, and the other thing. But a viable one-state movement, which certainly could exist, but like it needs some corporeal reality. It needs some symbolism. It needs some programmatic documents. I mean, people do, they do these Nakba Day marches with their keys, right? Now, if an Israeli guy says to me, Matt, I live in terror of these Palestinian kids with their symbolic keys, I'm going to be like, I don't know, man, like maybe chill out a little bit. Most people just kind of practice the symbolic rituals that they picked up from their parents. Surely we as Jewish people who are like repeating ancient prayers and things like that, like we can all get that. At the same time, like, it's politics, right? And like the symbolism matters. These are deliberate. I think part of what appeals about from the river to the sea as a slogan, part of what appeals about the key as a symbol is precisely that it carries some ambiguity. But, you need to, like, a political movement needs to clarify its goals. And I think a lot of classic Bob Wright stuff about the importance of cognitive empathy would serve, Palestinian activists.
It would serve the whole world well, yes.
Well, I mean, it would serve everybody well, but I mean, like, specifically on this, I think if they read you, they'll get a lot of criticisms of Israel that they already agree with.
I mean, look, I think there's Israelis a logic. Well. I mean, they would make a better two-state offer. It would serve everyone well. I agree, but I don't think that's the only obstacle. I mean, when I was in the West Bank,
a very large obstacle is that the Israeli government doesn't want.
There's all
peace. Like, they want to kick all the Palestinians out.
Okay, but this is my what one thing I would say in response to that is, if Palestinians in the West Bank, and let's just focus on the West Bank for now, started just doing these demonstrations, saying just peaceful demonstrations, saying all we want is the vote. You are the government that rules us. You say you're a democracy. The Jews who live 500 yards from us get to vote. All we want is the vote. That would be a very powerful force in international politics. Now, the Palestinians will tell you, if you start doing something reasonable like that, the Israeli government will do all it can to shut it down. It'll jail and kill whoever it has to jail or kill. That's what they say. But there's another obstacle, which is that now I haven't been to the West Bank in 12 years or so. But back then, what some people would say about demanding the vote was wanting to vote in asking to vote is normalizing the occupation because you're accepting the legitimacy of the Zionist government. Now, I would add, this was back at a time when, after the Israeli withdrawal, Israel had kind of succeeded. I think this was a big part of the goal of the withdrawal from Gaza, was to kind of separate Gaza from the demographic equation and make it so that it was just like West Bank Palestinians that Israel is thought of as being responsible for. And then, for one thing, if worse comes to worse and there is a vote, you still got a majority Jewish vote and so on. And so when I was talking to these West Bank Palestinians, I think when you thought about them being given the vote, you were kind of thinking about them being given a vote that would not lead them to like a 50-50 split, but they would still be a minority in Israeli democracy. But for whatever reason, that reaction, which I don't know how active it still is, that is something of an obstacle as well. There are a lot of obstacles. And look, I'd be happy with a two-state solution. If I thought you could actually withdraw all those settlers, fine. But I just saw a documentary about the withdrawal of settlers from Gaza in 2005, and that was only 10,000 of them. And believe me, that was like pulling teeth, to put it mildly.
Thanks for watching Nonzero Clips. To hear more of this conversation and others like it, subscribe to the Nonzero YouTube channel or the Nonzero podcast feed. And to gain access to exclusive podcast content, subscribe to Robert Wright's Nonzero newsletter on Substack.